So thank you everyone for joining us. As many of you know, this is part two to a webinar that Michael Leggett and Michael Gillenwater were our experts on a couple of weeks ago. And today we promised to make this more of a Q&A because we had so much content and so much Q&A in our last webinar, and we will make sure that everyone, once again, has the link to that. Thank you to Michael Leggett for ensuring that that's easily accessible and available. We really appreciate it. So just before we kick off, as a reminder, I'm Miranda Ballantyne. I come from the clean energy buyers world. I led global strategy for Walmart for several years, working on Walmart's goals to achieve 100% renewable energy and sustainable facilities. And then I was the Chief Energy Officer at the United States Air Force, and I was the founding CEO of the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance. And I'm going to have Michael and Michael introduce themselves, and then we're going to dive in. We have a couple of questions that you all posed after the last webinar, and then we've been collecting questions since the webinar. So we're going to take the first, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 minutes to go through some of the questions that folks have already submitted. And then if you've got additional questions as we go, please put them in the chat. Or I think we even have the opportunity to just raise your hand and speak aloud. So Michael Leggett, why don't you introduce yourself? And then Michael Gillenwater, why don't you introduce yourself? And then we'll dive into questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Miranda. Michael Leggett, I'm the co-founder of Evergreen. We're a marketplace around high-impact RECs and transferable tax credits. We've been working on kind of accelerating the transition to clean energy for 4 years now, and we're based in Seattle. And then before that, I worked on carbon removal marketplaces for about 4 years, and before that, I had a long career working on products. Actually, I was the lead designer in Gmail and worked on a bunch of different things at Google and Facebook for a long, long time. So, yeah, excited to be here.
I'll go next. Michael Gillenwater. I'm Executive Director of the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. My background is, I guess maybe, I don't know, well, I wouldn't say more varied, but primarily comes more from the National Inventory and UNFCCC, Kyoto Protocol, and Paris Agreement world. But I guess sort of all things greenhouse gas emissions, measurement, reporting, and verification, and inventories. But got into these issues years ago by helping draft some of the early parts of the GHG Protocol corporate standard way back, 20 plus years ago, and then getting involved in the early days of the carbon crediting space and the early days of defining, what RECs are and doing research in that area. And very interested in this for obvious reasons of like how do we move to the next generation of corporate GHG accounting standards.
Great. Thank you both. So I'm going to actually start with a question that I've been getting a lot lately, which is, what's the sort of idea or the hook or the promise or the purpose of matching accounting for scope 2 to one's load, both geographically and hourly? So I'll start with that, and there is plenty of good writing out there about this. But let me see if I can put it into sort of plain man language. The general idea is that at a very simplistic level, there is a perspective that it's not necessarily credible that a company might use a megawatt hour of power, let's say in December in the middle of the night in one part of the world, and then match it with the procurement of a megawatt hour of power during the middle of the day in the middle of the summer in another part of the world. That is sort of an illogical matching. And that a better matching would be for companies to account for and therefore procure an electron that is close to their load geographically and matched to the timing of when their load consumed the power. So that's the basic idea. There are a couple of companies that are really believe strongly that if companies procure in that way and focus on their own load, that it will help to drive the grid stabilizing technologies in those regions, and or will drive companies to get more engaged in public policy if where their load is, they don't have the regulatory structures to do power purchase agreements, or there are not market structures. So that's the general idea. We're going to pull that thread a little bit through the questions and answers that folks have brought forward. And one of the questions that you get is, well, that all seems logical. And would requiring companies to match their accounting to their loads, geography, and time actually improve the credibility and accuracy of greenhouse gas accounting? And there are experts, and I would also stipulate that no, it doesn't necessarily improve the accuracy and credibility of the greenhouse gas accounting. It does improve the accuracy and credibility of megawatt hour consumption accuracy, but that is a different thing than greenhouse gas accounting accuracy, because that megawatt hour procured in a different state at a different time of the day might actually be as good in terms of greenhouse gas emission impacts as a megawatt hour procured locally, and it might even be better if it's in a dirtier grid. So that's sort of a basic overview, but we're going to go into a lot more detail based on your questions. And the next question that we've gotten from many of you is, help me understand what actually is being proposed here. Would this require me to do 24/7 hourly matching in my procurement? Would I be able to account for the PPAs that I've already done? Will there be a grandfathering clause? Will I be able to account for REC procurement that I've already done? So Michael, maybe you can reground us in what exactly is being proposed. Michael Leggett.
Absolutely. And I'm going to add on just a little bit. I think great answer to the previous question. I think I would add that I think the idea is to finish the job. I've heard this kind of phrase a few times of like we're, kind of in the last, stretch of the race, and that we just need to round off and make sure we're using clean energy in every hour. And I think there's a lot of parts of the world that are not close to the finish line that are just starting this race. So I think there's some of the questioning is around, is that appropriate to try to be finishing the race when a lot of places are still starting? To the second question of what is being proposed, what is being required, what is kind of a should versus a shall. I think it is, I think some of the criticism has suggested that, hourly matching equals 24/7 CFE, or requiring that you have to get to 100%. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is not requiring that you match 100% of hours. So I think formally and technically, no, they're not requiring that. But I think functionally, there is a case to be made that this is kind of what will happen. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol does not operate in a vacuum. I think that there are other things built on top of this. SBTI is also moving towards hourly and local matching, and SBTI does set targets for 100% matching. So I think that it is accurate to say the Greenhouse Gas Protocol does not require it, but there is a large ecosystem here. I think also there's going to be some companies that, if there are any carve-outs that are going to be small enough, they can still claim 100%, renewable energy. And so I think there's going to be a lot of companies that can still claim that. There's also going to be companies maybe on that are close to big wind resources that are more easily able to do it. And so it will be somewhat normative to still have 100% matching claims, or very high matching claims. And so I think it's going to be hard in an ecosystem where companies have set these goals to say, well, never mind, we're not actually going to reach for that anymore. And yes, we know some of our peers are doing that. And yes, we know SBTI is requiring that, but we're going to ignore all that because it's not required by Greenhouse Gas Protocol. I think that falls a little bit flat. So I think what is being the greenhouse gas protocol itself is saying basically the market-based method where you can buy EACs or RECs or GOs to address your inventory, that those shall match an hour and tighter location, tighter kind of regional boundaries. That is the core of kind of the accounting change that is being offered. There's some details of that around. You had asked about grandfathering. Grandfathering would currently there are provisions to allow existing long-term contracts to continue to count, but those are only in the current greenhouse gas protocol recommendations. SBTI, again, back to that part of this larger ecosystem, does not have any kind of grandfathering clauses. So I think it's important for us to look at the full ecosystem and how companies are going to navigate all of this. Anything to add to that, Miranda or Gillenwater?
Yeah, I would add just a couple quick things on what is being proposed. And to be clear, we don't have the full proposal out yet. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol intends to release for public comment the draft. Some of the limitations under consideration would be a threshold for which companies and which loads need to account for their hourly and geographic consumption for Scope 2 market-based method. So there has been discussion about the geography requiring your load to be 5 gigawatt hours or more, 10 gigawatt hours or more, or 15 gigawatt hours or more. And there is not full clarity yet what's going to define a geography. Would it be a state? Would it be a node? Would it be an RTO? So there's still some uncertainty about what the geography boundary would be and what the threshold would be for who would be required to report your load matched to your procurement by that geography and by that hour. 10 gigawatt hour load is actually relatively small. It's a couple of large retail stores. So while that may sound big, it's actually not that big. And what this might do for some companies is actually divide up their load, where in some geographies they meet the threshold and have to match and report hourly and by geography, and other geographies not, which in my view is, after 25 years of doing these kinds of contracts, is going to make it very, very difficult for companies to aggregate your own load across broad geographies, potentially across a country or a region, as you're doing now, or as they're doing now. And that broad geographic aggregation of load across an annual timescale is really fundamental to being able to be a quality off-taker on a power purchase agreement for a long period of time, which we know from the developers that those long-term power purchase agreements at scale are really critical for them to get their projects financed. Without that guarantee of revenue over a long period of time, it's much harder for developers to get projects financed. So that's one concern. I want to say one more thing, and then I think Michael Gillenwater had a thought on this question too. Despite those thresholds, I also have some concern that the thresholds ultimately won't matter. There becomes a reputational risk that if matching one's load to their procurement on an hourly and geographic basis is considered the best standard, that all companies will feel compelled to do it. Likewise, even if they don't, we've really lost that comparability within Scope 2. If one company is required to match their load geographically and by hour, and another company isn't, or one part of a company's load is required to match geographically and by hour, but another part of the company isn't, the data we're going to be getting in Scope 2 is going to be very hard to interpret and very hard to compare. But the reputational impact of not following that standard, even if you're at a lower gigawatt hour, is real. And so I do think this requirement is going to impact most reporters of scope 2. And we will also get into later in the questions whether this will actually improve greenhouse gas outcomes, which is a totally separate question, is would this kind of reporting requirement and or procurement approach actually improve the greenhouse gas outcomes, which is ultimately what we all want. Michael Gillenwater, did you have any other thoughts on this question?
I mean, yeah, I mean, it goes back to this question. I mean, I think there's another follow-on question here about, what are we actually trying to do here? So I don't want to go to, jump ahead too much that someone submitted. But I think a key point here is this continued focus on matching when really under all this is what we want is corporate PPA and other kinds of actions to drive more renewables and therefore displace more fossil fuels. Um, and the mechanism by which that seems to be happening most effectively currently, at least in some jurisdictions, is by de-risking projects. With these kinds of long-term, upfront contracts, PPAs, and in various forms and whatnot. Not by it's and that happens not in terms of a matching function. It's by making that upfront investment under long term. So anything we do, even if it's in the name of increasing whatever the perceived fidelity of matching, isn't necessarily. I mean, if it harms that de-risking function in the marketplace that corporates are increasingly playing, then we've potentially done more harm than good.
I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions because I think this segues right into those well. And I think Neil Fisher asked a great question around what do you see as a primary purpose of impact metrics? Is it to support voluntary corporate impact claims, or is it to evaluate the impact of technology selection, siting, operating decisions, incremental resources, kind of regardless of who caused it? And I think that ties into kind of what is the purpose of RECs and EACs? Are they meant to like cause things to happen or just take credit for things that already happened? What is the role of consequential impact in an inventory? So a number of questions kind of related to that I've thrown at you, but if you want to try to opine on those, I think those are really good questions.
Yeah, this is where I think we've gotten something very fundamentally wrong. Um, I mean, I come originally from the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory World, IPCC guidelines and whatnot. Um, and you know, I think of the analogy. We spend a lot of time defining like what is a good inventory, like what are all the rules for it and whatnot. In that case, and we didn't. The IPCC doesn't try and set up market mechanisms, and emissions trading systems, and like integrate them into national inventories. Like that's a separate policy process that has all sorts of things that, there's lots of things related to setting up market mechanisms of emissions trading that are unrelated to what a good inventory is. And sort of what we're trying to do here is essentially build, market mechanisms and emissions tradings, and not just do so with sort of like one kind of unit, emissions allowance or credit. We're trying to, basically open it up to like every kind of imaginable EAC, someone can conceive of. In this case, we're talking mainly about RECs, but obviously there's lots of other instruments people are now proposing. And it's just, and then trying to do it again in the context of like what a good inventory is, and understanding what a good inventory is doesn't tell you how to design a good market mechanism. There's lots of other issues for those that familiar with emission trading system design and carbon credit system design. There's a lot of other factors that go into like thinking through those issues. And the analogy here is, we're trying to tighten in the boundaries of what, making things hourly and location more specific and whatnot. Essentially, what we're doing here is playing with rules to kind of manipulate supply and demand of these certificates, and essentially, drive demand in certain ways and constrain supplies in other ways. And those are all legitimate, market design questions. They're just not inventory questions. And you don't answer them by going back to like, what is good transparency? What is good accuracy? What is good time series consistency? Onward and onward. So I think we said it a little bit in the previous webinar, like I think all of us here support market mechanisms, and support, using them to get more cost effective and deeper mitigation action. But we need to just be clear and honest about what we're doing here. And that's, the market-based method for scope two, and as well as market-based methods for other parts of corporate reporting. We really need to I think, separate that off into a separate bucket and say, okay, we're designing a market mechanism here, and we're going to optimize it to achieve mitigation impact as the overall market. And to answer that question, you need to do consequential analysis, right? You need to say, okay, if we design the market this way, this is what we think, the market for hourly recs or whatever, what impact it will have, and then recognize and have companies report on that impact. And again, none of that is answered by, just saying, what is an accurate way to match megawatt hours for inventory accuracy.
And I think the purpose of all of this is to maximize, the impact that companies can have. I think that is, we want to understand what the problem is. I think you do want an accurate accounting of kind of how much further we have to go. And I think there's value in that. But I also think we want to maximize the impact of the corporate, kind of the voluntary market. It is one cog in a bigger machine. It's not the only driver, but we need every driver possible, especially as, tax credits are getting pulled away and other kind of, costs and tariffs keep going up. So everything we can do to kind of decarbonize the world as fast as possible seems of the utmost importance. Miranda, what should we do next? I want to be sensitive and make sure we've got a lot of good questions rolling in. I want to make sure we get to a lot of them.
Yeah, we do. The next set of questions are really around this third metric. So although the title of our discussion today is the limitations of 24/7 load matched accounting, lots of folks that are deep in the weeds on this know that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has also been considering a third way to report. So of course, the first way is your location-based method of accounting, where you're accounting for your emissions based on the grids where you have your physical plant operation. The second has been the market-based method, where you're accounting for your emissions based on the market activities you've taken. That's the one we're mostly talking about today. But there has been a proposal to add a third approach, which some call an emissions matched accounting, some call consequential accounting, and it has now been sort of coined as the marginal emission method. So can we talk a little bit about that before we do go into that? And because some folks are saying, well, if we've got this third approach to actually account for the greenhouse gas impact of the procurement, doesn't that work then? We're matching by hour and location, and then we're also rerunning our numbers to look at the impact of the procurement. If we do all three of these, doesn't that kind of solve all the problems? So maybe we can talk about that a little bit. But we also got an interesting question in the chat. Our first question in the chat was around the other emissions and the other externalities. So for example, if we were all procuring carbon-free energy close to our loads and matched to the hour, wouldn't that also help with SOx and NOx and other effluents and emissions from gas or coal-fired power plants? And indeed, taking an emissions matched approach or a consequential approach where you're doing your procurement, matching it to the dirtiest grids as opposed to matching it to your own load, That certainly helps for the atmospheric level problem of climate change. And Michael Gillenwater has been working on, these market-based methods for many years. And those of us that are old enough to remember the ozone layer, these atmospheric level challenges, the atmosphere cares about the emissions. They don't care about where your load is consuming power. But this person's question is correct that local emissions, SOx, NOx, smog, all that stuff certainly does care about the location more. For the purposes of this conversation, we're really focused on the atmospheric level challenge of greenhouse gas emissions, since this is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and greenhouse gas accounting. So why don't we get to this consequential accounting, this third method? Where does that stand? And if we had that, would that sort of solve the load matching? We had a couple of questions from Heat Map, from Neil, and some other places. Talk to us about that, Gillenwater.
Sure. And this is in the context of, what call it a consequential metric. I'll just use that term for now. What that looks like is still being fleshed out. The Scope 2 technical working group, had some, draft ideas around it. Technical working group under the GHG Protocol. And there's some, other work going on in other venues about, different ways to think about it. But I think, the fundamental idea is looking at, actions companies have taken. Typically, it's related to, you know, indirect emissions where, the inventories have either not capturing those impacts or struggling to capture those impacts. And it might be because they're kind of quote unquote beyond value chain mitigation is one term of art. Or just because they're farther out in the value chain, or in the case of power sector, they're in this what we call activity pool, meaning it's kind of a pool of energy or resources or whatnot that a company's just tapping into, but you don't know exactly where your energy in this case is coming from exactly. And it's just sort of inherent to the structure of the commodity. And so, the question is, and the market-based approach is like trying to get around that inherent problem with inventory accounting. But again, what we really care about is the impact of those actions. So can we develop a metric, a corporate performance metric that applies these consequential impact evaluation methods? And I think the answer is yes. And then the next question is like, do we need to somehow integrate that into the inventory? And that's some of the things that places like the Value Chain Initiative and some other things have been trying to do, is trying to figure out how to take consequential results that tell you avoided emissions or enhanced removals, and somehow bring them into the inventory, essentially, effectively sort of treating them like an offset. To be honest, is really what's happening, or do they need to be reported separately? And the consequential metric would create a place for those to be reported separately instead of trying to force them into the inventory. And then the question is, what is that? What is those kind of reporting standard and framework looks like? I mean, the GHG protocol has something that I think most people are familiar with, project standard, which gives some high level guidance on how to do project impact type stuff. Again, it was originally focused more on sort of the crediting space and the offsetting space, and it looks at like one project at a time. What we don't have is a kind of reporting framework and standard for how would a company report all of its interventions, so meaning like across multiple projects, and which projects count, and how would you kind of aggregate up those impacts, both, again, avoided emissions and enhanced removal impacts across many interventions. Again, which ones count? How does it interface? Do they need to be, if they are sort of overlapping with inventory boundaries, what does that mean? Or if they're outside the inventory boundaries, what does that mean? All this is complicated by the fact that with scope 3, the inventory boundaries are unclear, and even with scope 2, like we mentioned earlier, that the boundaries of what grid you're drawing from, i.e., what is the limit of your activity pool, is also sort of unclear. Um, um, but So we're missing that broader framework. And that work I should have been done, ideally would have been done a decade or two ago, but just wasn't. Um, and now we're trying to play catch up. Um, and then I'll pause here, but I'll just mention it. And then there's also so those are for like actions that try and reduce emissions. So that would be like a PPA, or buying a whole bunch, committing to hourly RECs for like the next year, 24/7. And quantifying that impact, not just in terms of megawatt hour matching, but actually what fossil fuel emissions are you displacing through that action, and looking at that across all your actions. Um, there's also the question of what we call an all consumption or induced emissions type of metric, which is like, on a marginal basis, like what how would you say it's hard to explain, but if I stopped consuming electricity, you know how much emissions would cease, um, um, essentially it's trying to argue like what are my emissions caused by all my consumption, and then and using that as a benchmark against which to evaluate your interventions. I didn't explain that very well, but maybe Michael Leggett, I'll trade and let you jump in.
Well, I think there's
So
a
let-
big question that touches on this a little. And then, Rand, I want to make sure we're staying on time. But there was somebody asked related to this. There's a couple questions related to it, but one of them said the expert technical working group. So there's a working group, there's several working groups, but there's one focused on scope two, put forth this proposal and voted strongly in favor of some consideration of impact accounting, consequential impact, or kind of marginal emissions. There's a couple different names and different ways to slice it. I think the key thing that's happened between our last webinar is this one is they voted to put that forward, but the independent standards board that approves what goes out for public comment voted not to move forward with that. Now there's still possibilities. I think it's possibly moving to another working group, being considered more broadly. So I don't want to say, doom and gloom, it definitely can't happen. But I would say there's a lot more uncertainty, as it is currently not going to be part of Scope two's guidelines or protocol. Scope 2 would just be the location-based and market-based, and market-based would be required to be hourly and locally matched unless you are under certain kind of conditions that we touched on earlier. So there is quite a bit of uncertainty here. I think if that was included and it was an optional parallel path, that might be a release valve for some of the concerns we have. But I just wanted to add that.
Yeah,
Great.
I was just gonna, real quick, so I think part of the rationale, and I'm reading between the tea leaves here a little bit, but I think part of the rationale for what the Independent Standards Board did, I mean, we've got folks in the GHG Protocol secretary on the call here as well, and maybe anyway, we can maybe let them jump in a second if they want. So this is the action and markets technical working group within the GHG protocol. I think the logic is that these market-based kind of consequential metrics are increasingly becoming, I guess, important or of interest to not just the Scope 2 power sector crowd, but to the broader kind of value chain crowd for different commodities, agriculture commodities, and all sorts of things. And so the question is like, do we design a consequential metric just for kind of power sector, electricity impact claims, or do we need to look at how a consequential metric would apply across all sorts of market-based claims using all sorts of EICs and kind of do that holistically? And I think I think actually we do need to do it kind of holistically because there might be ways you think about it for scope 2 that won't work for the broader marketplace. Now the problem with this is is that the work by this, AMI technical working group is on a much slower track. So it means, you know, anything that would help the power sector kind of scope two crowd with a consequential metric is now being kind of delayed because this broader work is moving slowly.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit back to the idea of requiring 24/7 geographic matching to one's own load. We have a series of questions that are all getting around the same question, which is ultimately, would requiring this type of accounting, which will lead to this type of procurement, actually cause greenhouse gas emissions to go down? And there are three questions in the chat that are underneath this. Since we agree that the idea of trying to maximize impact of accounting methods don't all the capacity expansion modeling research over the last 2 years point to hourly matching and deliverability as the most impactful method? Then another question is, Michael Leggett, you raised that we care about emissions impact, and they emphasize that's an understatement. That's why we're all doing this. But can you add a therefore in terms of the Scope 2 proposal? And can you elaborate on the commercial and practical consequences of requiring in-region hourly matching, which you discussed in your paper? And I will also actually put in the chat, in response to some of these questions, the link to the extensive research and modeling that actually points to hourly and geographic matching to load. Actually, many models indicate that we are going to see a dramatic increase in greenhouse gas emissions if most companies reorient towards this type of matching. So I'll make sure that everybody has those links, and we will also include them in our Q&A. But Michael Leggett and Michael Gillenwater, why don't you expand a little bit on, will requiring companies both to account locally and by hour and to procure locally and by hour, is that going to have the greenhouse gas impact that we're all actually trying to achieve here?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to what enables a project to be built. Because we need to both build a lot more renewables, but we also need renewables to work every hour of the year. I think that is an important goal. I think to Gillenwater's point earlier, one of the best things, if not the best things companies can do, is de-risk these projects. These are 25, 30-year assets with a lot of upfront costs and unknown revenue streams. And so these long-term contracts do so much to de-risk these projects and enable more projects to be built. So I think that the concern is moving to hourly and regional matching makes it harder for companies to de-risk these projects. Some companies will still be able to do that, but a lot of companies will no longer be able to do that for various reasons we discussed in our paper. They'll no longer be big enough. Their load won't be necessarily large enough. There'll be too much risk. Some of the RECs from a PPA won't be usable because it won't match in time. So there's a number of reasons why it puts pressure for companies to stop playing this role of de-risking projects. I think that there are this theory of, if companies are willing to spend more for RECs in certain hours, and if RECs are scarce in those hours, and if projects can be built in that region to address that scarcity, and if the voluntary spot market and kind of power to provided during those hours provides enough financial certainty for projects to be financed and built, like maybe this all works. But there's a lot of ifs there, and I would say very few projects are built on speculative energy prices. So this is called a merchant project, where it's built without a long-term contract on the energy. And energy is a much more robust, kind of market. Whereas the market around RECs really is, a lot of it has to do with rules set by entities like Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So the value of those may, change in 5-10 years as the rules might change. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that while RECs are a key carrot that has companies, using these contracts and de-risking these projects to meet their goals, that is why companies are primarily doing this. I think that a lot of this is under threat. And so I think if companies aren't de-risking projects and we build fewer projects, then yes, I think that we may have if you compare it to the counterfactual of had companies continue to do PPAs and those continue to grow, those in the last couple of years in the US, PPAs are now responsible for more than unbundled RECs in the US. So that is a growing trend we want to see continue, not to reverse.
And I'll just add, I think Miranda's, I think mentioned, we'll post a collection of studies we have, and I'm kind of I guess part-time academic, so I'm not gonna affirmatively claim that we know hourly, a shift to hourly matching is definitely going to have a huge mitigation impact, or that it's definitely not going to. I think, as Michael said, the problem is the uncertainty, and I think we have kind of with reasonable confidence a sense that it potentially will negatively impact one of the dynamics, this kind of long-term de-risking. It has a high likelihood, a reasonable likelihood it's going to negatively impact that, which is concerning. But more, anyway, I'll just stop there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I did put a number of things into the answers, which hopefully you all can see, but we'll make sure that that gets around. Importantly, to Michael Gillenwater's most recent point, there is absolutely not consensus that this one approach to procurement is the optimal approach for all off-takers. I don't think that there is conversely evidence that any other particular approach is optimal for all energy consumers. The reality is energy customers have very, very different load profiles across many different geographies. Some are highly centralized, large, new load that can be optimized for 24/7. Others are highly dispersed, little tiny loads that really are better optimized when they're aggregated. Other loads move around. Think of a movie maker who, for 6 months might be filming in Australia, and then another 6 months they're filming in Utah. The inability to aggregate that load over wide geographies and wide timescales means that they will revert to buying local RECs, which may or may not have any real beneficial impact.
I think I've got a quick anecdote, like really trying to drive that point, which is say a company's in New England and they've got a bunch of kind of stores and warehouses across New England, New York and Maine and Connecticut and other places. And they've signed a 10-year VVPA with a wind farm in North Dakota. This is something similar to what Boston University did several years ago, where coal is still the primary source in North Dakota. So they are therefore trying to maximize their decarbonization impact. That contract's going to expire in 2030. They were going to renew it, do another one, but under hourly and require matching, they can't do that. Now they need to procure in each of those states, each of those regions. And in New York, the state already has kind of strong goals and incentives to make the grid cleaner. So it overlaps with kind of the I think it's called RGGI and New York CES goals, where the utilities are already trying to work to meet those goals. So you're saying companies don't try to decarbonize a state that's being left behind. No, you need to focus locally where there may already be broad support and efforts to decarbonize that local grid. So you're kind of handcuffing companies to kind of be smarter about things. And instead of driving new additional energy somewhere else, they're simply making it easier for the utilities to meet the goals that they're already obliged to meet. And that feels kind of backwards to me.
Well, we have got a long queue of just fantastic questions. So we may end up also writing many of these. So there are several questions around the question of additionality, which is not the topic of today's conversation. I will say just briefly from my perspective, the idea of additionality, meaning one entity being the sole entity that gets to say that they were the straw that broke the camel's back to make a project happen, may be an outdated way for us to be thinking about it. And this is Miranda Ballantyne's perspective, may not be Michael and Michael's perspective. The material impact that an energy customer can have on carbon-free energy is really what we're after. We want We want regulators who are setting emission and clean energy standards for their states to be working with customers. We want those customers and those regulators to be working with tax policymakers. We want all of those things to have a combined impact on both launching new clean energy projects. We need 1,200 gigawatts of new renewable energy capacity every single year. We need a lot more new. But there are also existing carbon-free energy assets around the world that need to be protected from retirement. So a material impact could be an off-taker repowering a nuclear plant or a hydropower plant or a wind plant that otherwise would be retired. So this idea of additionality versus material impact, and how do we get everyone rowing in the same direction so we can all have material impact on getting more projects protected, built, saved, and we all get to say that we've had material impact in a way that we can measure it credibly to know that our contribution was a piece of the material impact is important. And that is an evolution that as we have become much more mature as a community and as an industry, we're seeing that it often takes the clean energy standard from the government, the production tax credit or the investment tax credit from the government's tax laws, the access to the land, and that long-term guarantee of revenue that the two Michaels have been talking about. We see that it takes all these things. So that's just my one comment on additionality, which is a little bit out of the scope of the conversation. Let's see. We do have an interesting question here, a couple of questions that have to do with the impact of this requirement globally. So we have a number of people on the call today and in the last call who are from companies that are either based outside of the United States or have operations outside of the United States, or who have supply chains outside of the United States. And we have a couple of questions there around who's driving this 24/7 focus. We have one question specifically asking, isn't it really US big data center companies that are driving this? And what does that mean for a European-based retailer or an Asian-based manufacturer? Are these really possible outside the United States? We have another question from New Zealand, where the grid is already very green. And how would these kinds of rules impact in a region like that? So can you talk about that? And then there's, also a regional question around a kind of, again, coming back to that simplistic argument that it's not credible or logical if we continue to allow companies to claim to be using solar power at night from electricity generated in a different place during the day. How can we continue to have public support? So that question of the credibility of usage versus emissions impact. And I'm going to sort of underscore that. I'll say that again. This is about what are we claiming for usage versus what are we claiming for greenhouse gas impact? Because those are two different things. And in my view, this is the greenhouse gas protocol, not the usage claim protocol. So there's lots of different places. We've got EPA's Green Power Market Program, the RE100, SBTI, so many other places where we can talk about usage claims. Michael, can you talk to us a little bit about the geographic impacts? Is the 24/7 load matching movement really being driven by a few large US companies? What would be the impact to companies based in other markets? Talk to us a little bit about the geographic component and then the usage versus greenhouse gas impact component.
I can take the first stab. I'll try to keep it short. I think that I echo what you're saying. I think this is greenhouse gas protocol. I think we should be focused on the emissions. I think there's also like FTC green guides. There are other ways of kind of regulating what companies can claim, setting targets, SBTI and others. So I do think that within the emissions, I think that's an important kind of piece to zero in on. I think that usage. So I think there's kind of usage, there's matching, then there's the real emissions. And I think that kind of focusing on the emissions, I think maybe it's somewhat radical, but I would say I don't care if a company is claiming to use solar in the middle of the night. If they really did help build up a solar plant in a place that is where the grid is dirty, I think more solar can mean real emissions reductions during the day. What I care more about is did they do something to materially, alter the kind of the future that we go down, the path we go down. And I know that gets into consequential impact, and that's outside inventory accounting. And how do you do that? And there's a whole rabbit hole there. I'm not trying to say that it's easy, but I think that, again, kind of concern of out of, and I also very briefly would say I think that the companies are just a few companies really behind this. I think Google is one of them that's really been an ardent supporter. And I think what Google is doing is they are still doing the PPAs and they're looking at the hourly matching because they have so much, load, they have so much demand in very kind of centralized locations. It is possible for them to do 3 PPAs to support one data center, as opposed to someone else who's got storage across, many states that they aggregate to do 1 PPA. So I think Google truly believes that this is the way to kind of finish the race, and emphasize, storage and, advanced geothermal and other technologies to kind of fully decarbonize our world. I do believe that it's not some nefarious plot to give them an advantage and make it harder for everyone else. But I also think that there is a lack of understanding of what it is to not be Google, and what this would mean for everybody else to kind of continue to participate and also, have an impact on things as we, hopefully focus on the emissions, not the usage claims within greenhouse gas protocol.
I'll just add, I think I mean, that's a good kind of case again, what we're doing here. When you're designing a market mechanism to kind of maximize its, cost-effective mitigation impact, you might set up a whole bunch of rules, the way you design, what sort of certificates or whatever gets counted, how companies can claim them. Again, this is all happening in a voluntary context. So, designing market mechanisms where participation is voluntary just adds a whole nother layer of complexity. But you do lots of things that, might deviate from kind of a physical real world accounting, because by biasing or tweaking the rules, this way or that way, you actually maximize the impact, even though, it might from a purely scientific standpoint, sort of, not be the most accurate way to try and, account for something. Because companies are made up of people and people make decisions based on all sorts of factors, right? It's not just a greenhouse gas thing. And so, just reiterating my, kind of first point, if we think about this as designing a market mechanism, again, to maximize mitigation impact, we come up with, we ask the right questions. We design these rules, like we can think about like like how do we use hourly matching within that market mechanism, and how can companies kind of make reasonable claims based on that, so that that market mechanism has as much impact as possible in a voluntary reporting context. Unlike some of the modeling, we're just kind of, which assumes like everyone in the economy is going to, or is going to be matching to a certain percentage. Here, companies have a choice just not to do it, right? Or not to participate. And we have to consider that when we're setting up these rules.
So we have 4 minutes left and lots more questions. This has been really great. Thank you to everyone for putting all your thoughts in the comments. I'm going to take a stab at one. We've got several questions around what are we actually measuring in attributional accounting, and what are we actually measuring, for example, in the marginal impact method, and are they offsetting, and what's the difference between all of these things? I'm going to try to put this in as plain language as I can, because Michael told me that I lose people when I give this answer, but I'm going to try to put it in really plain language. Each megawatt hour of, let's say, I'm going to use renewable electricity as an example. I'm going to use wind as an example. Each megawatt hour of wind actually has 3 different emissions impacts that could be measured and could be included in accounting. The first is the zero emission factor. All wind has a zero emission factor. So if you put a wind project next to a nuclear plant, it still is a zero emission factor. And that's what's measured today as the emission factor. If you put that same wind project next to a coal plant, it still has a zero emission factor. But the second thing that you could measure, the second attribute you could measure, and what it would be measured in the proposed or a notional marginal emission method, is the avoided emissions. So that same wind project sitting next to a nuclear plant is actually not avoiding any emissions. Even if it's in the same geography and same hour of my load, if it's just offsetting or displacing nuclear, the avoided emissions are still zero, and the emission factor is still zero. That wind plant that's sitting next to the coal plant, you could measure the avoided emissions of not running the coal plant for the same megawatt hour that you just ran the wind. So those same two projects, both are a zero emission factor, but they have very different avoided emissions impacts. The third way that you could measure is actual reduced emissions. And reduced emissions is a totally different measure. That is what is allowed to be used in offsetting or allowed to be used in things like the old Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement. And that is where you're actually certifying that the coal plant or the nuclear plant has actually down powered. So they are actually three very different attributes. And today, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol really only focuses on the first, which is the emission factor of the megawatt hour generated. So that's sort of a wonky way to say it. I hope that that was plain language enough. But I do think that this is a really important distinction. And even those of us in the community that are most expert often talk about those three attributes as if they're the same thing, and we confuse them. So with that, we've got 1 minute left. Michael and Michael, why don't you each give some parting thoughts? And we will again commit to putting together answers in writing to all the great questions you all have put in. Why don't you give us your 30-second closing thoughts, and then Gil and Water, you can go next.
I think this is a really important discussion. I think the comment period will open up in October for Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And so I think it's important for everyone to kind of understand these things and to weigh in as that opens up. We will answer the questions we haven't answered. And I think there's some other questions that have been put out there that we're going to try to answer. So we will continue to try to do all we can to be a part of the dialogue as we all work together. We're all on Team Earth. We're all trying to decarbonize our world, and it's complicated. And so I think as much as we can continue to, meet each other where they're at, assume good intentions, and try to find the best path forward.
I'll just briefly add, for those of you that aren't already, I would just suggest you stay tuned to the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute newsletter. Go to the website. We'll have 2 new papers on this topic, specifically focused on a multi-statement reporting framework. So how do we deal with these problems with inventories, the need for a consequential metric, and other metrics that, in combination, give us a more complete picture instead of this current status of trying to shoehorn everything into a greenhouse gas inventory that can't do all these things. And then after that, we'll be coming out with a paper kind of fleshing out, a longer paper fleshing out like what that I mentioned earlier, this broader consequential reporting framework could look like, and thinking through all those complexities. So much more work to come. Mentioned that's more broadly than just focus on scope 2, but obviously we need to think about this holistically, not in isolation.
Great. Thank you again to Michael and Michael for your expertise, your level-headedness, for continuing to remind us that we're all on Team Earth. And thank you to everyone that participated and put in so many great questions. Sorry we missed so many, but we will once again be sure to write up our thoughts and answers. And all three of us are available. Reach out to us on LinkedIn if you don't have our email addresses, and we're happy to continue the conversation offline. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks everyone for your interest in this.